Mr. Abdulwasea Mohammed, Mr. Peter Salisbury, Ms. Luqman, and Ms. Radhya Al-Mutawakel for joining us today, and for my colleagues for being here. And again, I apologize if I have butchered your names. I apologize. Last week, the subcommittee held a hearing with Tim Lenderking, U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, and Sarah Charles, Assistant to the Administrator for the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, USAID, to discuss the ongoing humanitarian and political challenges in Yemen from a U.S. policy perspective. In a follow-up to that conversation, this briefing aims to understand more directly how the war in Yemen has impacted civilians, how international and local organizations are supporting people on the ground, and how the Yemeni people themselves are involved in peace building, humanitarian work, and other grassroots efforts to create a stable, secure, and prosperous Yemen. The conflict in Yemen started over 8 years ago and has resulted in over 377,000 deaths. Over half the population facing high levels of acute food insecurity and untold amounts of damage and destruction. In April of this year, the United Nations brokered a historic ceasefire agreement between the Houthis and the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which successfully halted military operations, allowed fuel ships to enter Hadara port and commercial flights to travel in and out of Sana'a, as well as allowed for humanitarian organizations to increase operations and reach the most vulnerable communities across Yemen. While the ceasefire was renewed for a successive 60-day period until October 2nd, the parties were unable to come to an agreement on a renewal. Despite this lapse, there has been no widespread resumption of fighting between the parties, and members of the international community and local actors remain actively engaged in bringing the parties back to the negotiating table. I'm eager to hear from our briefers today about how the components of the ceasefire were received on the ground, what they believe are the core challenges in returning to the truce, and what the prospects are for a long-term peace agreement. The challenges in Yemen go beyond the need for a political agreement. The Yemen economy is currently divided along territorial lines of control, with civilians in Houthi and IRG-controlled areas facing two separate central banks, different currency values, and volatile access to energy and other daily goods. Further IRG import restrictions created major shortfalls of critical goods and fuel, which in turn allowed the Houthis to drive up inflation and artificially increase prices on the black market. These realities have made it incredibly difficult for average Yemenis to earn a living and to put food on the table for their family. I want to learn more about how the economic warfare in Yemen is driving conflict and the humanitarian crisis in the country, and what needs to be done to address these challenges. Of the more than 377,000 deaths in Yemen due to conflict, nearly 60% of those were from indirect causes such as lack of food, water, and healthcare. Today, 21.6 million Yemenis remain in desperate need of assistance. That's almost 2/3 of the entire population of Yemen. Although humanitarian access has increased since the ceasefire went into effect in April, concerns remain about ongoing bureaucratic impediments and movement restrictions, particularly in Houthi-controlled areas and when humanitarian actors travel between Houthi and IRG-controlled areas. Despite these setbacks, international NGOs are working side by side with and through local partners to help reach the most vulnerable people across Yemen. I look forward to engaging with our briefers on how humanitarian access has improved since the ceasefire, what more can and should be done to address bureaucratic impediments to aid delivery, and how international organizations and local actors are working together to meet the needs of Yemeni people. Finally, it's important to recognize that any solution to the conflict must be achieved through Yemeni to Yemeni dialogue. Ongoing peace negotiations must incorporate diverse Yemeni perspectives, including by engaging with women, youth, civil society, and other local leaders. The situation in Yemen is complicated, it's divisive, and it's heart-wrenching. I'm grateful that this committee has the opportunity to highlight local Yemeni leaders and the important work these individuals and their organizations are doing on the ground to support the people of Yemen. It's in the U.S. and global interest to secure an end to the conflict in Yemen and address the economic and humanitarian challenges facing the Yemeni people. And while the international community and regional actors have an important role to play, it's ultimately the people of Yemen that must determine their own future. I will now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for his opening remarks if he has joined us. Yes, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman David Cicilline, for convening this briefing, and we appreciate the panelists for joining us today to discuss humanitarian conditions in Yemen and civil society's efforts to advance peace. The Houthis' recent rejection of the UN ceasefire extension raises serious questions about their genuine commitment to Yemen's long-term prosperity, as Iran sacrifices the people of Yemen for their autocrat benefit. It is the Yemeni civilians who suffer most from continued conflict, including Houthi aggression fueled by support by the murderous Iranian regime, which yesterday provided Iranian drones to war criminal Putin to attack the district in Kyiv, Ukraine. I visited on Saturday, being on a Codel to the courageous people of Ukraine. According to the UN, an estimated 23.4 million people in Yemen are in need of humanitarian assistance in 2022, and up to 19 million are food insecure. We are deeply concerned by the Houthis' ongoing manipulation of aid and rejection of the truce dictated by Iran terrorists. It is the Yemeni people who suffer the most. Those living under Houthi control are subjected to horrific human rights abuses, including arbitrary detention, torture, and gender inequality, and frequently denied access to much needed aid. The needs in Yemen are great, but as the largest donor to the 2022 UN Humanitarian Response Plan, the United States must ensure our assistance to Yemen is not enabling the Houthis to worsen the humanitarian crisis caused by Iran. We look forward to hearing from you today on how the international community can help improve the lives of the Yemeni people and advance stability in Yemen, both in the long and short term. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I will now introduce our guests. Mr. Abdulwasea Mohammed is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Oxfam in Yemen. Prior to this role, Mr. Mohammed has worked as several INGOs and internationally funded programs on humanitarian action and development of various provinces in Yemen, including at Handicap International as National Mine Risk Education Officer and the German Agency for International Cooperation on projects related to institutional and community development, livelihoods, and gender. His Yemen work began in Yemeni Socotra Island with the Italian Red Cross, where he contributed to establishing the first Yemeni Red Crescent Society branch on the island. He has testified in front of Congress previously, including in front of this subcommittee. Mr. Peter Salisbury is a consultant to the International Crisis Group and the World Bank and an adjunct lecturer at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He was a senior analyst for Yemen at Crisis Group from 2018 to 2022 and a senior fellow at Chatham House from 2016 to 2019. A veteran journalist, researcher, and policy analyst, Mr. Salisbury was the energy editor of the Middle East Digest and lived and worked across the Middle East from 2018 to 2014. He's currently based in New York. Ms. Muna Luqman is the founder and chairperson of Food for Humanity and a co-founder of the Women's Solidarity Network, the largest women's network in Yemen. She has mediated between armed tribes and established water projects which have benefited more than 120,000 families and is currently working on security sector dialogues with Yemeni security forces and civil society stakeholders. Ms. Luqman frequently briefs the UN Security Council and Human Rights Council, is a member of the UN Envoy's Amam consultations and the GCC Yemeni talks, and is a finalist for the U.S. Institute of Peace 2022 Women Building Peace Award. Ms. Radhya Al-Mutawakel is the chairperson and co-founder of Mwatana Organization for Human Rights, a Yemeni human rights NGO which advocates for human rights, accountability, and capacity building of local communities. She's been working in the human rights field for nearly 20 years, covering a vast range of topics such as war crimes, arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, and press freedoms. Mwatana has received several awards and was nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize and one of Time's most influential people in 2019, and has presented her work across the world, including at European Parliament, the UN Security Council, and in front of this subcommittee. I will now recognize Mr. Mohammed for his opening remarks, and I'm going to turn over the gavel to Ms. Manning for the remainder of the proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here representing Oxfam. Oxfam has been present in Yemen since the early 80s, providing assistance to Yemeni population. Since the escalation of the conflict in 2015, we have been able to help more than 3 million people in 9 governorates across the country with clean water, sanitation services, and also cash assistance to help families secure their daily needs. We have been able to construct and rehabilitate water systems using solar panels to secure access to families, including internally displaced people, to safe and clean water. and that is also including in hard-to-reach areas of the country. Our strategy is focusing on three pillars: the humanitarian programming, and also gender mainstreaming, and also the third one is working with civil society organizations across the country, both in the north and the south of the country. Before the truce, the security situation was challenging due to the ongoing conflict. We have been operating in a challenging environment. Actually, 2 years ago, Oxfam has lost a colleague due to the security situation in Lahaj and also in Aden. However, also after the truce, we have been seeing a lot of restrictions that have continued despite the truce. While the conflict and also the danger from airstrikes, shelling, or crossfire has reduced significantly, and also the number of casualties have reduced, and also decreasing the humanitarian needs, basically because of the reduced displacement. However, the humanitarian situation is still dire. The economic situation has been deteriorating, and also access constraints have continued. And I want to start with the most recent challenges that we have been facing since the start of the truce. In the north, we have seen the Mahram policy being enforced by the Houthi authorities through the Supreme Council for the Coordination of the Humanitarian Affairs in the different governorates in the north. And this has affected the mobility of our female staff in the different governorates. And also it affected our ability to reach women, and also to assess the needs of women and to get them the assistance that they need. The Mahram policy has been very challenging, and also we are concerned that it will persist. It has been going on for the past 1 year and a half now, and this needs a lot of pressure, not only from NGOs, because we cannot do a lot of things to pressure the authorities, especially in Sana'a, by ourselves. But we also need, the support from the US and also from the wider international community. Also in the south, in addition to the fragmentations and also the insecurity that has been resulting from a lot of fragmentation, different factions, the security situation has been very tense, and also this puts us in a lot of threat in terms of mobility. But also recently we have seen the internationally recognized government designating the Houthis, and they have been putting it in effect, creating an economic warfare. Basically, this is very concerning, and also it has already started to impact the civil society organizations in the southern part of the country. Now their accounts at banks have been freezed and closed, and they are being asked to move their financial accounts to different banks that are based in Aden. Otherwise, they will not be, their licenses to work in the south will not be renewed. In both parts of the country, the constraints have been continuing in terms of bureaucracies, in terms of delayed signing of approval or approving of the sub-agreements and projects have been continuing over the past few years, even before the truce. But also interference in the humanitarian operations have been present over the years, including after the truce. And this has been hampering or hindering our work and also our reach to different areas. Sometimes we had to stop our activities because of the red lines we see, and then the authorities, they have just to understand that we cannot comply with our humanitarian principles, and they allow us to resume work. However, we postpone our work for sometimes, which affects our beneficiaries in the different areas. There have been also the civic space has been challenged. The freedom of assembly has been affected very much in all parts of the country, and also this has affected our partners and also the civil society organizations that have been challenged in different areas with different issues, including or affecting their ability to speak up on different issues, and also to document different violations, and also to reach beneficiaries, including women with specific needs. We have been operating in a challenging environment and also dealing with different factions and authorities. And it's basically almost sometimes in different contexts and different governorates. It's like a country within a country because of different regulations, uncoordinated regulations also that have been affecting us as a humanitarian community, but also the situation, the overall situation where we could not implement some projects, and that puts us in a difficult situation, not only with our beneficiaries, but also with donors, and also it threatens the prospects for more funding, since now the humanitarian response has been sharply underfunded, only at less than 50%, which is also quite concerning, and mainly due to the challenging environment, which sends a signal to the donors that we are fearing that they will be shifting their focus due to this challenge. Despite this, we have been able to reach a lot of beneficiaries, and we definitely need your support to overcome the challenges across the country. I will stop here, and I look forward for questions later on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. I will now recognize Mr. Peter Salisbury for his briefing remarks.
Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon to you all. All right, so the question that I was asked to tackle was that of the economic conflict in Yemen, and the extent to which the truce has and had not resolved some of those economic factors. So the big picture story in Yemen is that the war, as wars do, has really shattered what was already an extremely vulnerable and fragile economy. People are simply making less money. And at the same time, the Yemeni rial, the national currency, has depreciated. It's lost value against the dollar. That's a big problem for a lot of Yemenis, because 90% of wheat, famously 100% of rice, most fuel is imported into the country. And these three items, rice, wheat, fuel, account for somewhere in the region of 40% of the total household expenditures for a family. And in some parts of the country, the rial has depreciated more than in other parts of the country. So the amount of money in people's pockets and what it will buy them has decreased quite precipitously. And that problem has really been exacerbated by this economic conflict between the Houthis, de facto authorities in the northwest on the one hand, and Yemen's now series of internationally recognized governments on the other. This conflict is really centered around the Yemeni rial and the central bank control of the central bank, and fuel imports into the country. I don't think we have time to get into the specifics of how all of this works, but going into the end of 2021, early 2022, the government was limiting the amount of fuel that was entering the Houthi-held control port of Hodeidah. And the Houthis, in turn, were taking a series of economic measures to try and make life very hard in government-controlled areas. What the truce has done is allow a set number of fuel imports to come into this Houthi-controlled port, which people had hoped would alleviate some of the cost of living problems in Yemen. But in fact, what's happened is, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine this April. That pushed up the price of fuel on international markets. So the Houthis and people in Houthi-controlled areas, indeed Yemenis in general, haven't really felt many of those benefits from this freer flow of commodities into the country. And this indeed is why the Houthis introduced, well, it's not the only reason to be clear, but one of the reasons why the Houthis introduced this demand of civil servant and then later security and military salaries, which is what blew up the UN-led talks over the course of the year. They want to have more money that they can distribute to their constituents, and they also want to see some people in their areas paid, because at the moment what's happening is they've entered into a truce and they haven't really been able to show much benefit to ordinary people for it. And there is a great deal, I would say, of debate within the movement about how they should move forward. So we're in this quite challenging position where all of this is happening, and the Houthis, in order to strengthen their leverage, have started firing drones and other objects at oil export facilities controlled by the internationally recognized government, which has prevented the export of fuel from government-controlled areas. That's the main source of government revenue and one of the main sources of hard currency in Yemen. So we're in this position where, fortunately, oil prices, commodity prices are coming down on international markets. But as long as this sort of truce without a truce stage that we've been in since it lapsed on the 2nd of October continues, we're likely to see the parties taking these kind of actions, as Abdulwasea said, including the government designating the Houthis as terrorists, trying to shut down bank accounts, commercial access to Houthi-controlled parts. We're going to see them doing these things that nonetheless keep the cost of living high. So we really need to see movement, not just towards a renewed truce, an extended truce, but really to starting to deal with this economic conflict via the UN and the international track. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Mr. Salisbury. I will now recognize Ms. Luqman for her briefing remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Mr. Wilson, distinguished members of the committee, and my fellow speakers. I recently returned from Yemen, where I witnessed the tragedy of this war, deteriorating infrastructure, a collapsed economy, the risk of famine, snipers, and landmines. At Food for Humanity, we address these needs by delivering community-based aid with long-term development solutions. I will address the 3 obstacles that we face: aid obstruction, restrictions on freedom of movement, and youth radicalization. Aid obstruction, looting, and aid diversion created a war economy that drives poverty in Yemen, and each side of the conflict enforces obstacles that impact humanitarian aid. In Houthi-controlled areas, banks and ministries are harassed to allow Houthi control over financial resources. This has hindered many programs and deprived starving families. The Saudi-led blockade of Sana'a Airport and Hodeidah Port, although partially lifted, continues to restrict the flow of fuel, food, and medicine when we are dependent on imports. Arbitrary restrictions on freedom of movement, including road closures, and the Houthi siege of Taz are causing unbearable suffering and preventing Yemenis from traveling for both medical care internally and abroad. These restrictions limit both humanitarian aid and the private sector. Yemeni women and girls additionally face the mahram requirement, which forces them to travel with a man or with written permission and deprives them from working, going to school, and receiving or delivering aid. Warring parties take advantage of economic desperation and radicalize Yemeni youth. In Houthi areas, children as young as 5 years old are forced to repeat violent slogans against Yemenis and the United States, which fuels recruitment of Houthis, AKAP, and ISIS, which are also active in southern and eastern governorates. The answer to radicalization is education and livelihoods. To conclude, the war and the blockade must end, and state institutions must be restored through an inclusive peace process that incorporates private sector who are rebuilding the economy, and civil society leaders, especially women who are building trust between parties, and Southerners who hold a just cause. It is crucial to restore Yemen's security and judicial institutions for stability and human rights and to combat extremism. The US should work with the international community to establish monitoring mechanisms and pressure all parties to the conflict to end obstruction and diversion of aid. I commend the efforts made by the Saudi program for demining and urge you to pressure all parties to stop using landmines. All parties, especially the Houthis, should be pressed to fulfill their commitments and return to the negotiating table. The important efforts of the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Yemen should be strengthened, and the Riyadh consultations from the GCC are good steps. We must build on this progress. We must not and cannot abandon hope. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Luqman. I will now recognize Ms. Al-Mutawakel for her briefing remarks.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again. I'm glad that you're not bored of me. As you may know, we are an NGO that have a big field researchers or a big team in the ground. We are documenting, one of the things that we are doing is documenting the violations by all parties to the conflict all over Yemen. We have documented thousands of incidents against civilians and civilian objects since the beginning of the war, but only during the truce, we have documented 400 incidents during civilians and civilian objects. It's like, for example, the ground shelling from Ansarullah Houthis, from the Saudi boards, from the Yemeni government, and also landmines by Houthis, child recruitment by the parties to the conflict, torture, forced disappearance, detention by all parties to the conflict, and other violations. But this is just to show that the war in Yemen is much more than the airstrikes and missiles. Even during the truce, even the truce was like a window of hope. Still, parties to the conflict were just committing many horrible violations. And from our documentation since the beginning of the war until now, it's very clear for us that most of the attacks against civilians are very preventable, and the only reason that we can have in mind that parties to the conflict are just continue doing these kinds of violations is the lack of accountability. So we have been asking since the beginning of the war to have an international mechanism for accountability, not only to investigate, but also to build files, to reserve evidence, and to make Yemen ready for any chance or avenue for criminal accountability. Unfortunately, we used to have the group of eminent experts that was created in 2017, but we lost it in 2021. And honestly, the US has let us down in this battle. We expected the new administration to stand by us, to have a strong criminal accountability mechanism through whether the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council. But what happened that they came in the last session in September in the Human Rights Council with a very, very weak proposal for international mechanism that is, it's not going to do any difference in the ground. It's much less than for example, Ukraine have, Myanmar have, Syria have, and Yemen is the worst humanitarian and human rights man-made crisis. And only for political reasons, we don't have this mechanism for accountability. So I ask through you in the Congress to push on the US administration, the new US administration, to be stronger in this file. And thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Mutawakel. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each. I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. First, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Alden.
Well, thank you. We have some noises going on here at the Capitol, so if you hear that, it's just part of the running of our day here. Thank you all for your testimony and for giving us some idea of what you're seeing on the ground. We recently had a hearing in the Middle East Subcommittee with representatives from the US government, including USAID and our special envoy. And one of the topics that came up was that despite growing humanitarian needs, the UN appeals for aid are underfunded by about 50%. And we can discuss the reasons around that. But even what has been pledged, we've been told that aid organizations and local media are reporting that little of the previously pledged commitments from the Gulf states and really from around the world have actually been implemented on the ground. And I was wondering what you could share with us, not just UN aid, but USAID aid, whether and how that's being implemented. I understand some of the movement restrictions and certainly issues around violence and the Mahram requirements, but is the aid that we are trying to get committed internationally and that we're pledging ourselves actually reaching folks, or do we need to be doing a better job of seeing how that's implemented? And any of you feel that you have an insight into that, please go ahead and jump in.
I think I can reply to that one also. I think that's a really good question, actually, and it shows that you have been following up the situation. Humanitarian efforts in Yemen, of course, the challenges are immense. The military confrontations and the armed conflict is in itself the biggest challenge. But if you really look at it, we for the past few years we've been doing the same thing, and the impact is not really that high. And I think there's a problem with efficiency. I personally have been advocating for the humanitarian programs in Yemen and operations to be restructured, to focus more on long-term projects, support livelihoods, programs that focus on agriculture, fisheries. These livelihood sectors are really a priority right now, especially that the people haven't had salaries for years and nobody knows when they will. And many people have lost their livelihoods. And I think that there are many grassroots and community-based approaches that we should put now as a priority to support them. They are doing a lot of good work, which is long-term and more impact. This is not to say that all the projects are not efficient or do not reach the people, but this is a prolonged conflict, and the humanitarian effects are going to need another approach, which is more efficient. I also want to say that there are other actors who really need to be involved in the humanitarian operations, such as the private sector, and I think that is really important especially for food security. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to add from their experience? And thank you, Ms. Luqman, for that.
Yeah, can I come in?
Yes, please.
Yes, so the humanitarian aid is like a lifeline for people, although there is a huge amount of restrictions from parties to the conflict, especially, for example, Houthis on the access of humanitarian aid. But in spite of this, it's still very important for thousands and millions of people, because in Yemen, the state has completely collapsed and they are not providing any services. So they depend, many people are depend on this aid, but the space of this civic space is shrinking, which make the work of international and local NGOs much harder when it comes to humanitarian aid. And that also needs a pressure. It needs even like a strong voice from the international humanitarian NGOs to against what the attacks from Houthis, especially in the areas that is controlled by Houthis, because we know that we think that, I know it's not their work to do advocacy and they want to deliver their services, but they have to have a strong voice against these violations in order to be able to do their work in a good way. And the US can do better in this to pay more money.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I have another question if you want me to keep going, and we can also hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And go ahead, Mr. Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to echo what my colleagues have mentioned, just to add, and also maybe to refresh that Yemen, has been already poor before the conflict, and the conflict has exacerbated the situation even further. Now, over the past 7 years, and I want to revert to what Peter has mentioned in terms of money in the pockets. That's the issue now, and that's why humanitarian aid is life-saving. Without humanitarian aid, we could see pockets of famine, and we could see, the levels of hunger and also malnutrition boosting. Do we need to change approaches? I think this needs a re-evaluation of the approaches we have been following in terms of humanitarian aid. There are areas where the conflict is not that active, and we could maybe pilot development to have that kind of balance, and also to ensure that money gets to people's pockets, and that they can depend on themselves. Over.
Yeah. Well, Ms. Luqman, in your testimony, you're discussing the radicalization, of some Yemeni youth and Houthi-controlled territory, and I heard what you were saying in terms of what you think should be done, but you were very brief there. Can you expand upon what you said?
Yes, definitely. I think it's really, it's very heartbreaking to see billions of dollars spent on warfare, and nothing really supporting our children and their futures, and even now. And I think that this has been overlooked, either by human rights organizations or by the international community. Generations in Yemen are being prepared as small young martyrs and combatants, and I think that we need a de-radicalization program for these young children. It needs to have more accountability. We need justice for these young souls who are being pushed and forced into battlefields, deprived of their education and their safety and security. So I think that, and this has happened all over Yemen, but now we have a systematic radicalization of young children in Houthi-controlled areas, in schools, and there are many videos and documentation of this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a real concern, for all of us, and I think it goes to your point about restructuring some of the aid around longer term solutions. Obviously, we need to try and meet the needs of the moment. Madam Chair, if I could ask one more question.
Go ahead.
Mr. Salisbury, when you were discussing the Houthi condition that kind of tanked the ceasefire extension, that's something that's of real interest to me. When actually, could you expand upon that, or on what led to the Houthis to make that demand, in your opinion? Because that seems to me to be, largely the biggest stumbling block to the, negotiations around an extension of a ceasefire.
Sure. So from the beginning of the ceasefire, so on the 2nd of April through the 2nd of October, the UN envoy and his team were attempting to broker an expanded, not ceasefire, truce, an expanded truce, both in terms of duration and conditionalities. So if they wanted a 6-month truce, which would have given them more time to engage politically without having to come back every 2 months, as they did between April and October, and try and renew the truce. And they were also trying to bring in some confidence building measures that would convince all parties that this brought value. And what the Houthis said from April was, we want you to pay civil servant salaries based on 2014 civil service salaries, payroll. This is not a new condition. This is something that's been discussed on and off since the beginning of the war. And indeed, salaries were paid nationwide until 2016, 2017. What happened was, in the very last week of September, the envoy traveled to Sana'a to see the Houthi leadership, and they said that by civil service salaries, they also meant people paid for the payroll for the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense. so the fighters and the people running security on the ground. And they further demanded that this be paid using oil export revenue earned by the government and be paid in effect as a lump sum in hard currency to bank accounts they controlled. That was too much for the government, that was too much for the Saudis, and I believe it actually raises internal red flags for the UN. They couldn't actually facilitate payment to fighters. As for the Houthi intent there, I think that they were looking to push negotiations into a much more streamlined format. They've really been seeking for some time to cut the government, first in the form of President Hadi, later in the form of PLC, out of negotiations entirely, and turn this into a bilateral track between their leadership in Sana'a and the Saudis on the other hand. And they've succeeded in doing this, because now what we have is most of the negotiation is happening between the Houthis and the Saudis, and the Saudis are making proposals that come close to meeting some of the Houthis' demands. But of course, the challenge we have here is one of calibration and balance. If you pay military and civil service salaries in hard currency in a fairly untransparent manner, that really sort of takes away a lot of the incentives for the Houthis to come to the negotiating table for a political settlement. They've got most of what they need to continue this quite frightening state building project, for want of a better phrase, that they've been engaged in. And at one of the same time, it allows them to build up for future military offensives. So it's challenging first on sort of you don't want to pay for your rivals' fighters piece of it. And then from a political and conflict resolution perspective, it's also extremely challenging. But what the Houthis have achieved is pushing things closer to sort of the final status negotiations that they want with the Saudis, rather than having things brought through the UN system, where it's a more multilateral, multi-party Yemeni approach. They want to settle things with the Saudis first, get their financial interests taken care of, and then in effect, almost Taliban style, negotiate a victor's peace with other parties. I don't know if others on the call would like to correct me on any of that.
Well, before you mentioned the Taliban, I was going to say it sounds familiar to me, having seen that process play out in Afghanistan. Okay, I'll yield back, Madam Chair. But thank you all for your testimony. Thank you for the work you're doing on the ground in a very, the most challenging maybe region of the world. We appreciate it, and you helped me better understand the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. I will now yield 5 minutes to myself. Mr. Salisbury, thank you for being here today. I want to talk a little bit about the financial issues. Separate central banks, different currency values, volatile access to energy and daily goods, particularly difficult situation for us to understand, particularly considering the already dire humanitarian situation and the destruction that conflicts brings to the people of Yemen. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the struggle for control of fuel and currency has deepened Yemen's economic and humanitarian disaster? And also, can you talk a little bit about what would it look like to have a process to reunite Yemen's economy? And is that feasible?
Right. So Crisis Group, who I still work with, published a very long detailed report on this subject this January. I do encourage people to take a look at that. It's called Brokering a Ceasefire in Yemen's Economic Conflict. The long and the short of it is that there are different ways of sending money in and out of a country. You can do it the way that we think about it, through a conventional banking system. You go to a bank, or you go to your computer, you click on a button, you say, I have this amount in my account, I want to send it over here. In Yemen, what we've seen is that people have lost access to the traditional banking system, but that the country still receives a large amount of remittances. That's my daughter just passing through the background. I do apologize. What we've seen is people sending money back, but doing it via what are called hawala networks, where you, rather than sending it via a financial institution, you give your money to someone, that person collects a lot of money, they buy goods, they send those goods to Yemen, They're sold into the local market, and the money you get from selling the goods are then used to pay out recipients on the other side, kind of like a Western Union, but in this case with a fuel tanker in the middle, because fuel is the highest value cargo that is entering Yemen. So it's the best ways in many ways of getting dollars into the country. So what happened from the beginning of the war onwards was that the different parties were looking for ways of cutting off each other's access to money. The Houthis were benefiting twice from fuel shipments into their areas. First from the taxes that they earned on fuel shipments entering their part of the country, and secondly from the fact that a lot of money was entering the country in this form of hawala. So people are sending their money to Houthi areas, which are the most populous. That's where all the dollars end up. The Houthis end up with control of many of the dollars that are being sent into the country in the form of remittances. Part of what the government did when they moved the central bank from Sana'a to Aden was to try and take some of that control of the financial sector, of financial flows back. And they've since introduced a number of laws where they're trying to get people to pay taxes before they enter the country, where they're trying to get people to only send money via the banking system that they control, to take some of this financial resource away from the Houthis. And what the Houthis did in 2019 was to ban this newer format of banknotes that the government had been printing in their areas. And what that led to was a concentration of older bills in Houthi areas. Sorry, I know it's like a little bit complicated. And it meant that there were lots and lots of bills in these much less populous government areas. And most of the dollars are sitting in the Houthi system. And what that led to was this bifurcation, this separation in the value of currency, where the Yemeni rial in Houthi controlled areas is somewhere between 500-600 rials to the dollar. So $500 or $600 rials buys a dollar, and it's more than 1,000 in government areas. And again, very dependent on imports. You don't get a pay bump, just like in the United States, because there's inflation, because of devaluation of currency. So people's money was simply worth less in government controlled areas. And since what we've seen is this tit for tat, where the government, to try and cut off the Houthis' financial flows, started stopping fuel shipments from entering Hodeidah. And we've just seen this thing escalate and escalate and escalate. And what I'd say, and I see that sort of I've spoken for most of your 5 minutes, and I apologize. What I would say is I'm not sure that you can reunify the economy right now. And in fact, there are some risks inherent to that. But what you can start doing is harmonizing the economy across these different zones, creating cooperation between Houthi-controlled banks and central bank in Sana'a, government-controlled central bank in Aden, but also looking at the way that trade flows across the country. Because one of the things that has happened is many major roads in Yemen have been cut off. And this actually has increased the party's control over trade, because you've got trucks going through these very narrow little roads, which are much, much easier to control. And that means you get to control the currency piece, the financial piece as well. And if we can start move towards doing things like getting these banks to talk to each other and maybe normalizing the rates of the rial, getting trade to flow across front lines through the country's major highways, it isn't a complete solution, but it would reduce the cost of living. It would reduce the cost of moving things, and it would bring down the cost of living in government controlled areas. Over.
Thank you. It's a complicated situation. I appreciate your way of explaining it. I'm going to ask one more question. Ms. Luqman, can you share more information about the impact of strict enforcement of the male guardian requirements and other restrictions on women's freedoms and movement in Yemen? And have these obstacles made it more difficult for NGOs to provide humanitarian aid?
Definitely, this is really something that's causing a lot of issues currently. We've always had this issue, actually. It's not something that has just suddenly come up, but it has become enforced in so many different ways. Women in general in Yemen are facing so many other issues, gender-based violence. We have women for the first time, hundreds of them, in prisons in Houthi-controlled areas. And this is also something that's being overlooked. This is a red line that's never happened in Yemen. I urge this committee to really take this as a priority. These are women who are defending their rights, asking for their salaries, making peaceful protests. So the women who are working in humanitarian work, especially, are being attacked on social media, defamation campaigns. Recently, even going to a restaurant in Sana'a is just become an issue, and you could be imprisoned for going with your brother or son, or so you have to have somebody with you, and you have to have documentation of that proves that the relationship to this person. So it's just crazy. But the women who are working in humanitarian organizations are facing it the most. The defamation campaigns have threatened their lives. They have been, some of them have actually been attacked physically, and there is no protection for these women. And in general, there's no protection for women in general, but these are women who are providing lifeline supplies for other families in Yemen. I hope that this committee can push this forward and try to put pressure, especially on the Houthis. But this, to be clear, this is imposed by all parties also. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mohammed, I'd like to ask one last question. Saudi import restrictions of food and fuel have exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, but so too have Houthi measures to drive up inflation and the price of goods on the black market. Can you describe what the current process looks like to import goods into the country, and talk about the extent to which the Saudi import restrictions has proven responsible for the humanitarian challenges in Yemen compared to the Houthi tactics?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. It's a very important one. Actually, the restrictions have been varying over the years. They are not the same now as they were a few years ago, and even since the beginning of the 2022. In the past, importing goods and supplies to the different ports in Yemen, especially to the Hodeidah port, which is a lifeline for over 70% of the population in Yemen, because it's mainly where Houthis are controlling. It's over 70% of the population. They are controlling that much of people who are in need, and the process has been very challenging. The cost of shipping things have doubled, more than doubled actually, and also the inspection process that has been happening, where the vessels, including fuel and also supplies, had to pass through ports in Jeddah. They had to be inspected, loaded actually, and sometimes I was actually in Aden a few months ago, and some port authorities, they were telling me that some vessels, some supplies, they have to be inspected and delayed for over 3 months. However, this has changed since the last couple of months, where the duration of delays has decreased to up to 1 month. This is still a delay, which adds up to the prices of goods, and also it adds up to the costs of insurance and demurrages for the different shipments. But I also want to flag that there are also excessive taxations when transporting goods across between the governorates, including in Houthi areas in the north, but also the capacity of the ports. Also, this is another issue that delays the offloading supplies, and also the fact that the supplies, including medicine, where they have to be left there under the sun for some times, and it undermines, their quality, and sadly, that ends up at the burden of civilians in terms of the market value, and also the the prices, and it adds up also to the fact that people have or suppliers they suffer, they get caught up between all these regulations between south and north, and this makes all parties accountable to what happens at the end at the civilians and what they have to suffer because of these restrictions, both from the Houthi side but also from the excessive taxations from both sides, but also the inspection processes that is taken that much on the sides of the Saudi ports.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. I'd like to thank all of our briefers today for being with us, for sharing your expertise. This is a serious moment for Yemen's security and stability, and your work has been instrumental in educating people on this conflict, providing much needed relief for the vulnerable communities across the country, and working towards a stable, secure, and prosperous Yemen. Thank you to all members who joined us this afternoon. And with that, this briefing is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.